Today, as I said, we have the beginnings of the Baha'i faith in Kansas, Missouri, and North Carolina with three speakers. First, we will have Dwayne Herman talking about the growth of the Baha'i faith in Kansas. And Dwayne has, all three of these gentlemen have hundreds of pages of research, which is very exciting. And of course, all three of them have been given 20 minutes, which can be extended to 25 minutes max, because that itself will run more than an hour. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and the Q&A, because we will get to them at the end of the whole thing. We won't do it in between each talk. We need to get the talks done first, but put your questions in right away so that you don't forget them, and then we will get to them as we can. Following Dwayne, Behrad Majidi will be talking about the history of the Baha'i faith in Missouri, and then finally Steve Collins will be talking about the history of the Baha'i faith in North Carolina. And all of them, interestingly enough, will be starting in the 19th century, mentioning newspaper articles. And then they will be moving on to the early foundings of sort of Baha'i groups, small communities, which sometimes came and went. And then finally, when you get closer to the middle of the 20th century, you have your first local spiritual assemblies and the beginning of larger, more stable Baha'i communities in all three of these states. So it's a very interesting pattern, and I'm sure you will notice this as we proceed. So without any further discussion, I will turn it all over to Dwayne. He can introduce himself and move on to talking about the subject that we'll be covering today. And I will stop sharing my screen so that Dwayne can share his. We'll all turn off our cameras so that we'll just hear and see Dwayne, and we will proceed. So thank you, Dwayne. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, everybody. I enjoy this. I have given a few presentations to the Kansas Association of Historians, and when I start those talks, I say I'm really delighted to be able to talk to a group of people who are interested in dead people, because a lot of other people aren't. And my children are so tired of me talking about this. So I'm glad to have a new audience. I'm going to do some screen sharing, and it will be a little bit slow because I'm slow. This is sort of a timeline. I hope you can see it. I'm going to try to move.
All good. Yeah, you're good.
Okay. But I need to be, the first newspaper was in Kansas was in 1868, partly because Kansas was just barely settled. There weren't very many European white people here before the Civil War. Then this is just an outline of some of the events that contributed to the beginnings of the Baha'i community here. And I end it with the recognized election of the Topeka Spiritual Assembly in 36. The first election was in 35, but the notification of that election did not go to the National Assembly. It went to the Chicago Assembly, which in the teens was sort of a regional assembly, and the people remembered that. They didn't understand this National Assembly thing, so it wasn't recognized. But that's where my book starts, so I figured that I didn't need to go much further than that because the book is down there and it's online now. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about 1897 because the events of that year are just unbelievable, and they wouldn't have been able to happen anyplace else. The sequence of events was remarkable, and the main point that I want to share is that Kansas has the second Baha'i community west of Egypt. When I mentioned that at a summer school one year, someone said, "You mean Egypt, Egypt?" And I said, "Yeah, that Egypt." And you could not have planned this to happen. This is just an outline of the news articles that were in Kansas newspapers just that year. There's nearly 200 of them that I've found so far. These are articles about what was going on in Enterprise. Different editors would comment on things. And then there's over 100 of this little bitty one-liner, which became part of the boilerplate, which was the standard part of newspapers, because back then, each newspaper each little town did not print its entire newspaper. It printed part of the newspaper. They got the rest of the newspaper pre-printed from a central place, and I haven't learned much about where those were. But these central places would print the national news and the international news and send it with blank spaces on the train to the little towns, who would then put in the masthead and the other local news. And there was this one group of snippets of stuff from all over the state. And this sentence got in that: Enterprise runs to religion and Abilene to baseball. Now, I underlined baseball there because it was 2 words 100 years ago. And it appeared in all of these. It started in the 20th of July and appeared in all of these newspapers up until actually November. And what's most interesting about some of these is the names of some of these, like the Plain Dealer, the Tiller and Toiler, and that one is still in existence now. The Unmuzzled Truth is my most favorite title for a newspaper. I just can't believe this. And Coolidge had not even 200 people in 1910. And there was the Freeman's Lance and others. It's the same little thing. It's in different parts of different locations on the page. But anyway, that's not the important part. I'm going to go back to the timeline. Oops, I don't want to do that. There we go. So that I can follow it myself. A series of events happened that brought the Baha'i faith to Kansas, and the first in that series was that Joseph Hilty, who was about in his 30s, he had survived service in the Civil War and the Indian Wars after that, and he had a son before he went to the Civil War. He had a baby right after that, and I'm not sure when she was born in that year. But he and a friend had gotten some lumber from a town 20, 30 miles away and were going home, and the boys were drunk. And back 100 and some years ago, it was not a crime to drive drunk, and it was not as dangerous because the horse knew its way home. So if you were drunk or asleep, the horse would still get home because that's where its food was and everything. Well, he fell off the wagon, truly, literally, and he died when he landed. The notice in the paper didn't say whether it was a broken neck or whatever, but that set this chain of events in motion because he left the widow with the 2 kids, and she had 320-acre farm, which she could not farm by herself. So her teenage brother was going to help her, and that was overwhelming for them. So their sister out in the plains of Kansas, where Enterprise is today, wrote and said, "Why don't you come out here? We have faith that this location where my husband has built the mill on the river, that we have faith this is going to prosper. The ground land is good. We're sure it's going to fill up with farms. Come out here and we're going to start a town and you can be part of that." So Barbara and her brother Michael rented out her farm, loaded up wagons, took stuff out to where Enterprise was. They built a stone house down the non-existent street from the mill and platted the town around her store and the mill. And she's not listed as one of the founders of the town, which I think is a travesty, but that's the way they did things 100 and some years ago. So she married Jacob Ursum, who was the machinist who forged the equipment for the mill. And they had 6 kids on top of her 2 kids. And then a distant cousin of his, and I haven't figured out this connection, joined that family. So there were 9 kids. But then the next thing that happened was their son, Herbert, suddenly died. He got sick. He got wet and cold and rainy and got pneumonia and other complications. And he was only 23. And that's why I wrote this here, so I could remember his age in the early part of the month. Now, so this was the 3rd intimate death in Barbara's life. This young man, her son, and then her husband. And when she was a teenage girl, a brother died. He was about 17 or 18. He fell out of a tree and was too injured. So all of these deaths. Then their daughter was very musically talented, and she had been to Chicago for more training. She also went to Europe and sang, and she'll be part of the Missouri story a little later. But she goes back to Chicago after the funeral, and that's why I've indented those 2 dates there, because that between November of 96 and January of 97 is the time when she would have come into contact with Abraham Kerala, and a newspaper article says that she was a believer from Chicago. And then there's two unknown dates. Sometime in there, maybe after November, maybe after she met and started the class, I don't know. But she told her mama that this new religious teacher, and Mama Barbara wrote to him and invited him to come to Enterprise. So those things set it up, and he came out that summer. And I don't know why that's doing that. And then some other uniquely Kansas events. When he started the class, because Barbara's brother-in-law was a local statewide he was statewide known politically. He had just abandoned the Republican Party for the Populist Party, and he was president of the Board of Regents for the State Agricultural School, and he was implementing his own understanding of the populist platform or something, I don't know. But he authorized what had previously been not considered valid use of state funds. He authorized the building of the first dormitory on a campus in Kansas, and that was outrageous. Then he authorized the building of the first bookstore run by the university, and people were up in arms because the residents of the city had, before this, had gotten their income from the students, renting rooms to them, selling the books to them and things. So people were in uproar, just the fact that he left the Republican Party, and now he was going to this class of this new religion, and Kerala did not understand a lot, actually, but he learned about the religion in Egypt where it was not really safe to be a Baha'i, and he had no idea that there had been news in Kansas. I mean, just the year before, there were big articles about the faith, and some of them said it was, they didn't really use the word Baha'i, it was mostly Babism and things, but that the name had been, the knowledge had been here, but he kept the name a secret. And so here was this high-profile politician joining this secret cult, and there was even rumors of one newspaper article that he was going to give Kerala a job teaching at the college. So people were up in arms. And then Hoffman, his name was Chris Hoffman, he did something that Kerala would not tolerate. He asked questions during the class. He not only asked questions, he wanted to know, he challenged Kerala on some of his statements, and Kerala couldn't stand that, so he kicked him out of the class. That made news. And then Barbara's brother, Michael, also asked questions. He'd been a state senator, so he got kicked out of the class. So that made news. And I want to read one short little clipping here. This is the kind of things that was considered normal news back then. This was in the Lawrence newspaper, which is nearly 100 miles away from Enterprise. So this stuff went all over the state. It says, "It is reported from Enterprise, Kansas, that C.B. Hoffman, the man who has been playing hammer and eggs with the Agricultural College, is a member of a new religious sect organized out there by a gentleman by the name of Abraham Kerala, late of Arabia," which is wrong. "The religion is said to be a conglomeration of mysticism, rationalism, and mesmerism. With wheels of that kind in his head, it is no wonder Hoffman wants to grind things up." And then another newspaper article, which I just find unbelievable, is right. I don't see it now. Well, it's called, the title of it, the headline of it is, "The Bible is Not the Truth." Maybe this is, anyway, I can't find that one right now. I thought I had pulled it up. And so that was the big headline. The Bible is not the truth. And down in it, it says the truth is in the Bible, but the Bible is not the truth. Then this appeared in Barbara's hometown newspaper. This was in May of 1920 when the article, when the design was adopted by convention. And so she got to see that. Then I'm going back a little bit because this is a recent discovery that the turmoil in Kansas was written about in the San Francisco Call, and then that was picked up and repeated in the Omaha newspaper. So this went sort of nationwide in a way. And then two of the Baha'is went to Chicago and met Abdu'l-Baha in 1912. One of them wrote her memoirs. One of the Enterprise Baha'is then moved to Topeka. She was the first Baha'i here. And when the second Baha'i declared in the 1915 or so, then the Baha'i activities began going on because she had a totally different source of information. And then when she moved away, things died down again, and then travel teachers came in 1933, and then that began the community that exists today. And Rose Hilty was in touch with those people, so there is a continuation actually. So even though Enterprise didn't survive, the Kansas Baha'i community did. And I will stop there so that I don't take more time, because I could go on for days about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Dwayne. Actually, you did quite well, because we started at 7 minutes after the hour, so you only took 13 minutes. So there's plenty of time for people to ask you questions later, I'm glad to say.
Okay. Well, I'm watching my clock up here, and I couldn't remember. We didn't start on time, but
well, I wrote it down. I wanted to be sure not to give you too little or too much, but that's good, because that means we will have plenty of time for questions afterwards. I had no idea it made national headlines. And
yes.
And I love all these stories of the controversies and confusions, the confusions the faith faced in the early days are really quite amazing.
It was a riot. It was truly an uproar. It just, oh my.
Yeah. People read their little local newspapers pretty carefully too, because what else did they have? There was no
That's
CNN.
Right. That was it. And we even know the day the Topeka Baha'i community started, because when the family left Enterprise, it was in the newspaper. They left on Tuesday for Topeka, and this was on Thursday. So we can celebrate that exact day. And I don't know that there's many other communities who can do that, because people are so fluid and flexible, and it doesn't get in the paper anymore.
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's move on and have Behrad turn on his camera and microphone, and Dwayne can turn his off. And Bahá'í, of course, is in the greater St. Louis area and has been doing research on the faith in Missouri for some time. And again, also has hundreds of pages of not just notes, but really manuscripts on many different communities in the state, particular individuals. He's collected quite a lot of information on Aurelia Bethlen. And we're looking forward now, Bahá'í, to hear what you've got to share with us. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Stockman. And if friends cannot hear me, I can get closer to the camera. I guess the hot and humid summers of St. Louis makes me to be indoor, and therefore I have a lot of time to work on my computer and do research. I would like to dedicate this project actually to my mother, Hava Rezvani, who passed away in 28. She was a very kind, compassionate person, loved prayers, and I've memorized some of the prayers that she chanted during my childhood. So I want to dedicate this to my mother, and also honor my wife, because while I'm on the front of the computer, she has to do and help the house to run and do things and take care of the kids. So really my special individuals in my life, my mother and my wife, Shohri. So let me open the file, share the screen. And if it's too small, I guess there's a way I can increase the size. So it's really a brief presentation of the faith, really covering 125 of the faith in St. Louis is not possible, and in Missouri. Therefore, I focus on the first 50 years, and that will be sketchy as well. But this particular period of time, the 50 years, was really a period of slow, I chose the word fermentation if it's appropriate, where the number of the Baha'is in St. Louis, or the believers, was really less than 10, and they would come and go. So there was really, at any given time, I would say during these 10 years, it will be a very small number of the believers in St. Louis. This project, to me, feels like being archaeologists, like digging out history, collaboration and research of others, like Mr. Herman helped quite a bit, as well as Dr. Stockman, who had some materials on the internet that helps me to research. So internet and its search engine is amazing. For those who wants to research their early history, they can go to, for example, the Star of the West or Baha'i News and Google and use the search engine and put the name of their community, and it can show if the names of their community has been mentioned there or not. First, when I began, I thought perhaps it would be only a few pages about the faith on these first 50 years from 1895 to 1945. But it turns out that it was more and turned to a chapter. And then searching more, it turns to a volume, and somewhere around 200 pages. So I hope that this also inspired a friend and bring joy to their hearts. The first reference to the faith in Missouri was a small town near Columbia called Fayette in Boone Lake Times. In 1846, there was a small column about the event happened in Shiraz. And you're all familiar with that, where Qudus and Mullah Sadeh Khorasani and another believer, Ardestani, were persecuted. And this news was published in New York Times, and this particular journalist or newspaper borrowed it from there and published it. So this will be the first mention of the faith in 1846 about the faith. It reads, "We see by late London papers that a schism has lately taken place among the followers of Muhammad, and a new sect set itself up in Persia." Won't go through the article at all. Mr. Herman mentioned about Josephine Healthy Kimmel. At the time that she became a believer, actually, if I'm correct, she lived in St. Louis in 1895. And as she was visiting in Chicago, going to music school, she became acquainted with the faith, and she enrolled in the list of the believers. And this is a picture of Josephine Healthy that Mr. Herman had sent me, which I put there. She was a music teacher, so she had published a book on that. The next person, so this was 1895. The next person that I was able to find out, I would call the first St. Louis born Baha'i, was Maudie Lamson. She actually was born in St. Louis, but later on she moved to Chicago, and that's where she became acquainted with the faith. She and her mother became Baha'is. And she also served as a secretary of the Chicago as well as surrounding communities and other communities in the United States, as the number of Baha'is was growing in this country. So that's 1896. The next person was Phoebe Hurst. She actually born in St. Clair near St. Louis. She was a teacher as well. This school building that you see here was a small school that she was teaching, and this has been transplanted now to a land where there is a foundation there for her in her memory. It's a non-Baha'i foundation. But when she married and moved to California in 1898, she became a Baha'i. And then the fourth person would be Mabel Rice-Ray Ivis, who also was from St. Louis, but when she was in Baltimore in 1899, she found about the faith and she became a Baha'i, and she lived in East Coast. Although Maudie or Phoebe or Mabel became Baha'is and they were from St. Louis, but they never were active in the Baha'i community in St. Louis, or did not come back to St. Louis perhaps. So I would say the first person from St. Louis who became a Baha'i while living in St. Louis and helped to develop the faith was Ella Rice-Ray. Now, Ella was the sister-in-law of Mabel, and when she was visiting Mabel and his brother in East Coast, she became acquainted with the faith there and joined the faith. So Ella joined the faith in 1905. And then she helped her mother to become a Baha'i, and then her mother was instrumental to bring to the faith a Campbell family, and then the first Baha'i group was formed. So this was a letter of Mr. Chase, for example, was written in 1908. So the first Baha'i group was in 1905. So meeting in St. Louis were held. Miss Rice-Ray and her daughter, Ella Rice-Ray, the first St. Louis believers, were there. And all of these have been members of Theosophical Society and are coming up to a conception of realities rather than imagination. This was a note by Mr. Chase about being in that community and visiting that community. Now, Ella became a Baha'i, as I mentioned, when he was visiting her brother and her sister-in-law, Mabel, and that's what she wrote. I asked, what is the word? And was given Allahu Abha. Briefly, I learned that word and used it. And it brought me into new revelation and daily increases both my strength and my glory in God and all his manifestations. So that was a really remarkable, sentimental note by her. As you know, these believers were communicating with Abdul Baha. We found some of the tablets that revealed in their honor, and there are like a dozen of them. I just share part of this here, particularly to do so. The question would be, so when was the first devotional meeting in St. Louis? As you know, in Missouri, we have hundreds of devotional gatherings now, but this, I would say, would be the first one, perhaps, in St. Louis area or in Missouri. As Abdul Baha says, console and show great love on my behalf to the maidservant of God, thy daughter, Ella Rice-Ray, and say, the meeting of worship that thou didst establish will undoubtedly bring important results. It will become the cause of promotion of the cause of God and the motive of firmness and steadfastness, unity and concord. These are really inspiring words for all of us who hold a devotional gathering. It's part of our core activities. Abdul Baha also addressed personal advice for Ella. For example, thou hast written about thy intention of getting married. Marry thou a wise, perfect, learned, experienced, and faithful person, so that thy time may pass in joy and happiness from beginning up to the end. My hope is that thou mayest be assisted in all thy affairs. Perhaps Ella could not find a husband with this description, so she remained single to the rest of her life. But she served the faith and she pioneered. This is a newspaper article I found through the internet when she was in a nursing home at age 90. And she's holding, the Baha'is having a feast in this pioneering post that she was in Indiana. And says Miss Rice-Ray was 90 years old in May, having been born in Missouri in 1878. In 1905, she visited her brother and family in New Jersey and heard of the new religion called Baha'i, which she immediately accepted and has energetically supported to this day. And this article, of course, is just too long to share, but I'd like just to go to the last part of it when she's in nursing home. And she explained to one of the Baha'is in a recent visit that she and one of the nurses tease each other. The nurse asked how much Miss Rice-Ray is going to give her for all the things she does for her. Miss Rice-Ray said, name your price. I'm a wealthy woman. Then she laughed, her eyes dancing, and she said, I am a wealthy woman in my spiritual brothers and sisters in our Baha'i community. So she passed away in 1970 in her pioneering post. To move on, as Mr. Herman mentioned, there are several articles of newspaper that was published in Kansas and Missouri. He kindly provided me with a list of these wonderful articles from this period of time, 1899 to 1911, which we won't go through them, but they were basically borrowed from more national or international newspaper. This particular group that I mentioned to you that generated through the efforts of Rice-Ray family were in St. Louis from 1905 through 1915. the Rice-Ray family moved out to Michigan. And then the Campbell family moved to California. So suddenly there was no Baha'is in St. Louis that we know of until there was some teaching work was done in 1916. Mr. William Randall came to St. Louis, and it was a very successful teaching in 1916 when there were large gatherings. And that could have been strengthened the seekers, and then the new nucleus of friends began to form from 1916 and 17. It's interesting that we read in the Star of the West that this successful teaching campaign has been referred to an earlier advice of Abdul Baha from one of the St. Louisian that said that the teaching is not working. And it says, thy letter was received, thou hast written that in these days the establishment of the meeting has become impossible in that city. Be thou not unhappy. A day shall come when innumerable meetings in the utmost grandeur shall be established in that city. And of course, the writer of this article in Star of the West says that 1916 was really the fulfillment of Abdul Baha's prediction of this that was written earlier. When we talk about the St. Louis Baha'i Assembly, probably the first Baha'i Assembly was formed in 1930s, late 30s, but there are references to the Baha'i Assembly as early as 1915. Although they were not organized the way we have local spiritual assemblies, but there were certain organizations and an appointment of like a delegate to the National Convention at that time was for the Temple Unity in Chicago, or they had a secretary. So I would say that can go as far as 1915. One of the secretaries, I would say, first secretary of the Baha'i Assembly in St. Louis would be Carolyn Barbie. There is a tablet from Abdul Baha via Julia Thompson to her. They say, convey my respectful greeting to Mrs. Barbie of St. Louis, and say, I hope that in this nether world thou shalt attain unto a heavenly light. And also Abdul Baha advised her, strive as much as possible in order to become godlike, lordly, illumined, and merciful, that thou mayest be free from every bond and become attached at heart to the kingdom of the incomparable Lord. This is Baha'i bounty, and this is heavenly light. So some of Abdul Baha's advice for the first secretary of this Baha'i Assembly in St. Louis. As I mentioned to you, this new group, which is listed here, I found 6 of them, and Carolyn Barbie was one of them, and Mrs. Lafferty became a delegate that she would go to National Convention or Temple Unity Convention. And there were others which I don't know much about them. Just 2 of them that I've been able to find out and needs more research. When Abdul Baha passed away, there was an article in St. Louis Post-Dispatch about Abdul Baha's passing. And then the formative age of the Baha'i faith began in 1921. St. Louis has been mentioned as one of the multiple communities, small communities, in a communication by Beloved Guardian in 1923. It says, though your number in each of these cities be small and limited, yet by virtue of that celestial potency bequeathed to every one of you by our departed master, you're assured that ere long your small company shall expand and wield such power and influence as no earthly power can ever hope to attain. Beloved Guardian also communicated directly to St. Louis Spiritual Assembly in 1931, which it tells me that there was an organized spiritual assembly. Chor Effendi hoped that you will exert all your efforts first in deepening your own knowledge of the teachings, and then to strive to attract other people. You should form study classes and read the important books that have been published, especially the Iran, which contains the basic tenet of the faith. The one who ponders over that book and grasps its full significance will obtain a clear insight into the old scriptures and appreciate the true mission of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. This dated 1931. In 1930s, we began to see a whole new group of individuals. Mr. Lewis Hudson was one of them, and he lived in 1934 in St. Louis, and I have also a picture of him of his birthday in 1980s. So I have written a biography of him. Also, Miss Nyan Hartfield, which would be the first Baha'i pioneer to come to St. Louis as a pioneer to establish a spiritual assembly. And Mrs. Bethlen, which was known to the history of the faith from the early parts, and another biography has been written for her in this volume. So Miss Nyan Hartfield in 1939 became the first Baha'i pioneers to St. Louis. In the Baha'i News, we read in 1940, difficult business conditions have been the lot of Miss Nyan Hartfield in St. Louis, Missouri. She said, I will not be discouraged, however, and will continue in obedience to prayers. She's quoted in the Baha'i News, and so forth and so on. And then Dorothy Baker visited St. Louis in May 1940, where our pioneer Nyan Hartfield arranged a meeting from which a study class has resulted. The first Baha'i Center in 1945 was a very interesting development. So his Baha'i teacher, Miss Moffett, Ruth Moffett, was visiting and had classes. And suddenly the hall that they're supposed to have the meeting was taken by another group. And that's the description written. It says the hall was engaged by other groups 3 nights during the second series when Miss Moffett was scheduled to speak. And another room in the same building was not available, nor in any other where our colored friends would be welcome. On Thursday, May 31st, a tenant vacated room so-and-so, and then the friends began to make that room, which was probably rented, make that the first Baha'i library or Baha'i center in St. Louis. But we also can see the issue of the race in St. Louis, of course, that even in those years, the Baha'is were promoting unity and oneness despite the odds in the society at large. There are a few Baha'is who have been appointed as the Knights of, or designated as the Knights of Baha'u'llah, who are from St. Louis, Elizabeth Laws and Roy Fernie. And so I'm going to conclude this presentation with a quote from Abdul Baha that says, this handful of days on earth will slip away like shadows and be over. Strive then that God may shed his grace upon you, that you may leave a favorable remembrance in the hearts and on the lips of those to come. That's probably a motivating reason to write the history. So if I could do these projects, anyone else can do it for their cities and state. How wonderful it would be that the history of the faith be written for each state of its first 125 years. In this spirit, the research history of the faith in Missouri, St. Louis, and surrounding community of this 125 years consists of 4 volumes, and this presentation just a small part of it. And my special thanks to Wilmette Institute. And thanks for my Persian tea, which made me really speak fast. So, with the caffeine in it. Thank you so much.
Perfect timing, Behrad. Fantastic. You had exactly 20 minutes. I'm really quite impressed that you did it, and it was so nicely organized and easy to follow, and very, very clear hitting of all these highlights. And I think it also helps give people a big picture of what they can do as well if they do their own research. So thank you very much. And I hope in the question and answer, we get to talk a little bit more about some of the techniques you've used, your notebooks and all that, but perhaps we can defer until later for that. So let's move on to Steve Collins. And let's see, Steve, I guess your camera is on. Good. Steve is a computer person in the Raleigh-Durham area, if I remember right, and has been doing research on the history of the faith in North Carolina for quite a while. He's also one of the people who works on the Bahaipedia website, and he's been putting a large quantity of his material up there as well. So he has a slideshow for us. And again, thank you, Steve, for joining us. We're very grateful for your presence and the opportunity to hear your account of the beginnings of the Baha'i faith in North Carolina.
Thank you. Let me quick share and then get my process started here. So yes, I'm going to try to summarize a lot of things. There's more going to be in the slideshow that I will talk about, and then in the slideshow there'll be links for people to chase more materials later. I also want to thank my wife and also mention Mr. Barnes's recent talk about love being such a powerful force. It helped motivate my approach on some of these details. A quick look at some of the areas that I'm going to mention are Wilmington down here, the area of Halifax County, which is basically up there, Raleigh and Durham and Chapel Hill, which constitute kind of the triangle of North Carolina, Greensboro, High Point, and Winston-Salem, forming kind of the triad of North Carolina, Charlotte, a big city in North Carolina, and then Asheville, which is out here, will be also mentioned. As a preface to this, I wanted to mention first that we had tried to do a survey of the history of North Carolina in 2016-17 for an institutional attempt at summary of the history, and I emailed a bunch of assemblies that I could track email addresses of if they knew who the first Baha'i was of their city, who was when was the first assembly formed, who were the members, and nobody could help me get the actual answers. They suggested that I track down some elder Baha'is from years gone by, and maybe they would know. So we were starting from not knowing a lot of things, and I hope we'll have some of those answers here, but there's more answers that need to be found. Also, I was recently watching some YouTube videos about the first geological maps, about how somebody would start somewhere, drill down, get the samples out, categorize the layers of ground underneath them, and then keep careful notes of where they were located. And then they would just walk across the countryside, find another interesting spot, drill down, categorize the samples, take careful notes of where they were located, and they would just walk the countryside. And in many ways, it feels like what I've been doing. And I've been gathering, as was said, a lot of these articles about different cities, different individuals over at Bahaipedia, and then so that you can look at some of these. But all of this has only been done recently because the digital sources that were able to be used for gathering this information have only been online a few years. So it's been coming along. This is sort of my summary of the sort of geological layers of the history of North Carolina. We start with newspaper coverage mentions, as the others have mentioned, starting from 1850 in the case of North Carolina. We have migrants from North Carolina going to other places, finding the faith somewhere else, and then having an impact on the development of things. You have Baha'is traveling to North Carolina, starting from the winter of 1902-3, and then many more travels. And then Baha'is who actually lived in the state from 1915, the beginnings of communities from 1925, and then the multiplication of events and schools and centers and things, they really began from 1954. Here's that 1850 newspaper article. A new religious sect has arisen in Persia in consequence of the preachings of a man named Bab, who has written a new book to take the place of the Quran. He is said to have already made several thousand proselytes, and 18 of these Babis, as his followers are called, have been publicly beheaded by order of the Shah. I'm not going to get into the historical accuracy of this, but it's kind of remarkable that from, like we say, 1850 here in North Carolina, in two different newspapers, we had this article copied and echoed from other places. Here is a list of the people that I've been able to find who had roots in North Carolina. We're not going to talk about all of them, but the No Black family here mentioned, the Wilmette Institute hosted a talk by Judy Honan Moe, who did a talk about her family's history. That's very useful because it connects to the Pocahontas Pope story that happened she's from North Carolina in Halifax County and then went to DC where she found the faith. And there are many other people that we're not going to talk about right now. The Pocahontas Pope connection is actually alive and well in a sense because her house from her childhood is actually still standing. This is a mimeograph of a copy of a historical document that their county historical society put together. It was a clerk office, a government office in the town. The capital of the county was there, and then they moved the capital, so they sold the building off to private hands. It changed hands a few times, and then Pocahontas's mother bought it, and they lived there many years. And you can actually still visit it. It's now a historical site, though they don't know anything about the Baha'i connection. Here is a list of the trips Baha'is took to North Carolina that I've been able to find. I'm not going to cover most of them again, but here's the 1902-3 trip. I'll note quickly there's a bunch of 1919 references here, and this is the April letter from Lewis Gregory that we're going to look at a little bit. But then there were many more, all the way down to 1942 we're going to talk about briefly. So here's this mention of Sarah Farmer coming to North Carolina, and we had no idea this was happening. Nothing not mentioned anywhere. We were just looking in newspapers, myself and some other people, and just looking for mentions of Sarah Farmer, and there she is. She's going to North Carolina for the winter for the benefit of her aunt's health. We have no idea where she went, no idea what she did. The only other clue we have is that if you look at Ann Perry's book on Greenacre, it says that during that break, they reappeared in Greenacre in the spring, like May of 1903. So from December to May, she may have been in North Carolina somewhere with her family visiting, and who knows what they were doing. We hope to find out someday. Here's Gregory's letter from 1919. And I'm going to point out, in his letter, he didn't say where he was writing this from, but if you look here, he wrote the address. The story for this for me was I was reading through Champions of Oneness, and there was a footnote in there that mentioned that they knew where some of the letters of Gregory had come from. And it mentioned the place. So I immediately asked National, hey, do you have any letters from Lewis Gregory from North Carolina? Yes, this is great. Here's the first one. And it's 15 North 8th Street, Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, this isn't some random address. This is a very well-known address and has been the same address for over a century. This is the Saguar House, which is now a historical landmark. And then if you look at the date, you could think, well, is that April 7th or is this July 4th? But it was stamped, answered, April 11, 1919. So it's from April 4th, 1919. We won't go through it all, of course, no time to do that, but a couple of key points. He mentions a variety of things, including that this is not the first contact they had. The first contact actually came through an associate of Lewis Gregory's named Roy Williams, and he had some kind of previous contact with the Saguars and other people in the town, including Hubert Parris, whose name will also reappear. He also talks about race relations in North Carolina, in that in New Bern, they were good, and in Wilmington, they were bad. Things were very tough. A couple of us in a Facebook group have been working on transcribing the letter. Here's a quick look at just the fact that we've been doing that. Here is a list of the people who've lived in North Carolina that I'm going to cover a little bit of. We have the Saguar family that I will talk about some. I mentioned Hubert Parris. And then Sarah Martin, I'll talk about briefly a little bit later. So here's the Saguar family. On the left, you have Felice centered in that picture, and on the right is her father, Frederick. And there's a question about who came first. We have references that talk about Felice before 1919, maybe 1918. In 1919, 1923, her name is actually mentioned specifically in 1925. Frederick is mentioned in 1919 indirectly in this letter, and then again in 1925. Lewis Gregory has mentioned here several times as being the person that he's talking about. However, there's an oral history that Felice mentioned Frederick was first. So we're up still trying to figure out all of this history, but we've traced it back this far. This is from April 1925 in the Baha'i News. Wilmington, North Carolina during January afforded many opportunities for service. In the city, there lives a truly remarkable believer, a young woman who for 7 years has been devoted to the cause under most difficult circumstances. So 1925, 7 years kind of points to 1918 maybe. But again, it doesn't name her in this article, but there's no question among any of us that this is Felice. There's a couple of books that have been published about Wilmington history in general that mention the Sadwars a fair bit. And I'll also mention Anne Russell also gave permission for some of her pictures to be used in this presentation. And she might even be in the audience. If you go back to the article near the Menor Center, it says, at present, her long trials and sacrifices are bearing fruit, and Louis Gregory feels that in this city an assembly will soon be organized. This is the first time that we know of where we're beginning to hear that there's a community forming. And in fact, we have two other communities mentioned where there's a promise that people believe that there's an assembly that's going to be formed. 1925 in Wilmington, 1930s in Halifax County. In the 1930s and 40s in Raleigh, North Carolina, there was a prediction there would be an assembly. All of these were in the Black community. Each of them was supported by visiting Baha'is, but none of them became sustained. And I think in addition to things like just random events and people moving and the dynamics of individuals and groups, I think we should pay attention to the question of the Jim Crow atmosphere. There was a PhD done in 1980 that looked at the growth of the faith, and it came to a couple of conclusions. One of them is that the rate of growth in the faith in the South was underperforming the rest of the country, also in the Great Plains. The next point is that where in the South it did succeed was with the Black community along the states along the coast, which North Carolina is one. And that even though the Black community's response was several times the size of the white community's response, the overall population was still larger of the white community when it responded. And so far, you've seen almost no white response of the white community in all of this. So we have a lot of pressure, I think, in the communities about what's going on in North Carolina going on. We have this transition to communities happening. We have this transition to a sustained community approaching. In the first 7-year plan, which ended in 1944, there was a goal of an assembly in every state. And there were pioneers, homefront pioneers, who moved from different places to different places, an average of about 5 per city, per goal area. But that's not what happened in North Carolina. In February 1942, remember he mentioned Miss Moffett arriving in St. Louis in 1945. In February 1942, she came to Greensboro, North Carolina, tried to develop things here, and it took months, and she began to get response. Meanwhile, Adrian Ellis and Eva Lee Flack, who were then living in the West Coast, had decided to homefront pioneer to North Carolina. And in fact, Eva Lee Flack had grown up in Asheville, I've recently learned. And so when they left the West, they thought they were going to Asheville. Meanwhile, Ruth Moffett is succeeding in Greensboro. By the time they got to Chicago, they had been alerted to this and changed their plans and decided to come to Greensboro. And then there were a couple of other pioneers who came along after that to help with the community. There was a project going on in Asheville, but it wasn't as successful. This is the first spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Greensboro. And we have Louise Sawyer, who's here. We have Naomi Simmons, who's a Greensboro woman who joined in the summer of 1942. We have Adrian Ellis, Reeves later, who came from home for pioneering, and Eva Lee Flack here, who had come home from pioneering. The one man is John Goodwin, and this is his wife, Elise Goodwin. I know the names of the other 3 ladies, but I don't know who's who. The other interesting thing about this date with the first assembly forming is Hubert Paris came. So Hubert Paris had been in Wilmington, and then he moved into Halifax County, And then on the day of the formation of the Spiritual Assembly of Greensboro, he's there to declare, and his membership is accepted. So there must have been some kind of communication going on, and we don't know what it was. There's a mystery to be solved. From 1946, we have the story beginning of Mr. Tucker, who's the oldest living Baha'i of North Carolina right now. He joined in 1946 in Greenville, and then has done a lifetime of service, as well as being an auxiliary board member. He's traveled to all the Baha'i centers of North Carolina and given talks about his experiences, and is well beloved of the community. And many of his interviews were taped more recently, and some of these are online, and I encourage you to watch them to talk about his experiences encountering racist treatment issues in North Carolina and his struggle to overcome them from himself. So we have this transition. We had isolated communities, individuals, almost nothing sustained really before 1942. There were around 20 Baha'is in 1944 with one assembly. If you looked at the directories, you can arrive at these numbers. In 1963, you had about 70 Baha'is for the same sort of approach with 4 assemblies. There's some general nationwide statistics that by the 1960s, you had a growth of the community of around 30%. So maybe by around 1970, we had 100 Baha'is in North Carolina. And along that way, we have some spiritual assemblies that were formed. In addition to Greensboro, we now had Raleigh, and then Charlotte, Durham, Asheville, and Chapel Hill forming assemblies. And then we had Baha'i conferences. The Blue Ridge Baha'i Conference was held in 1954 with Sarah Pereira, I mentioned a while back. She had come to help make this happen. And I'd love to be able to look at this picture and say who these people are, but I don't know who almost any of them are. And then in 1955, we had 100 people instead of 75 coming from multiple states. And hand of the call as Paul Haney came. And then we had pilgrims from North Carolina going over to the Holy Land. And this lady is Marie Brody, who's the first Baha'i of the modern era of Raleigh. And this is Carlotta Holmes, the first Baha'i of Durham of the modern era. And with them were going Margaret Quantz and Frances Falvey. Frances and Margaret were homefront pioneers who came to North Carolina to help. But Marie Brody and Carlotta Holmes were native. Up until 1970, the entire state elected its delegates as one whole state convention. In 1971, that was broken into 3 regions, and then in 1991 into 6 regions. In 1971, too, there was a PhD student who happened to be in Raleigh at the time, and she observed some of these activities going on with the Baha'is, and then in 1977 had her PhD accepted out of the University of California at Santa Barbara. The last 2 lines I'll quickly read. The Baha'i community associated constantly with Baha'is from a nearby Air Force base and other small towns, bringing the total community to 30. The Baha'i Center was maintained, at which I lived, for meetings and as a community center for all activities. So this is an early snapshot about what's been going on in North Carolina. In 1987, we had the Black Men's Gathering Forum in Greensboro. They wrote a history book, and they have also done a documentary that can be watched online, which I recommend to people. In addition to a spiritual assemblies forming of their own accord, they began to register with the state, and this is the record that the state has of a spiritual assembly registering so they could hold marriages, they could own property as a corporation. From Greensboro to 1958, all the way up to Cary in 2016. And then we had the Regional Baha'i Council in 2008, and even though they've changed names and associations since then, they've continued to be registered. There have been a few books in North Carolina that mention the history of the faith a little bit somehow or other. I mentioned Ann Russell before. She did another one. She had done one for Wilmington. She did another for the whole state. And there's a couple other papers and books that have been published with some degree of coverage, including one master's thesis that looked particularly at the Piedmont, the middle portion of the state. And then in 1985, we have this picture of Felice Sajwar coming back. The Baha'is moved into Wilmington in the 1970s, thinking nobody was there. And then somebody remembered there used to be this family, maybe in the Sajwar. She was in this early newspaper. Should go look her up. Ran into her. Hey, the Baha'is said hello to Felice Sajwar, and she said hello to them. And then was an active member of the community for another decade plus. In 2017, we had the bicentenary of the birth of Baha'u'llah observed, and Jean Norris Scales gave a great talk, which was recorded. We don't have it online yet, but I hope someday soon it will be. She published a few articles in American Baha'i. She passed away in 2019. We had a great memorial for her. And this is the present day of North Carolina's electoral units. We have the 3 through the middle, and then on each end, spreading into Virginia a little bit. There are 22 assemblies in North Carolina today, 34 registered groups, and 24 counties where there are approximately no Baha'is. The state population via the ARDA database is about 5,000 Baha'is, and I was told that information actually came through the National Assembly. And the population centers are where those stars are, of the Triangle area, the Triad area, Charlotte, and Asheville areas. And we've had a seminar in the state sponsored by an assembly where we began to look at some of these things. It already needs revising. I have to go back and fix some things at some point. And then we set up a Facebook group to sort of meet and talk about these things and share stories. And people have shared copies of letters of the Guardian that we've received, and other things. A statement I wanted to summarize this all with is, of all the Baha'is that have ever lived in the state and served at the international leadership of the religion, 3 were black men and 1 was a black woman, without quotas or electioneering. Sarah Pereira, Glenford Mitchell, William Maxwell, and Kaiser Barnes. And then special mention should go to Matthew Bullock, who served on the National Assembly. He was born in North Carolina. And then also served as a Knight of Baha'u'llah, and Van Gilmer, who led one of the World Congress choirs, and then is the current leader of the Baha'i House of Worship Choir at a national level of recognition. We have email lists going on with all the communities. Here's just 2 fairly recent references in the email list to different Zoom meetings going on. Eric Dozier might be a name people recognize. There was a profile done of the Triad Baha'i community done on the US Baha'i website just last year, about a year ago now. And then most recently, we have this email that was sent out from the Regional Baha'i Council stating that they were buying a center to serve the Triangle Cluster for their institute meetings. The first time they're buying a center, they're not renting out different things. They're not doing Airbnbs. They're going to have their own building to host these events for the institute process. And then we have a number of web pages from different communities that I was able to compile. And I think I'm about done with what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I think everyone would agree we've had some marvelous presentations today. All 3 of them were very, very interesting and covered. It's really interesting how similar the histories of the early communities are actually in terms of the difficulties getting established and the length of time it took to get to the point where there'd be a local spiritual assembly. I think we're at the point where we can have some questions and answers. And I see we have various things in the chat already. So let me see what we've got here in the chat. There was already a question that I saw for Dwayne. Someone asked, when was the first assembly formed in Wichita?
And I know who that is. I know who's asking the question, and I know the answer. A Baha'i from New Jersey came to Wichita. I think his occupation was listed as traveling salesman in 1902, and he taught someone, and they both wrote a joint separate letters to Abdul Baha. The answer came back, but they had both moved away by that time, and the answer ended up back in New Jersey. And in that answer, Abdul Baha describes Wichita as that vast and remote country. And anybody who's ever been out here knows it is vast, and there's nothing else around Wichita. Then a pioneer came from Topeka in 1937 or so, and they tried to do some things, and some travel teachers came in the late 30s, Gail Wilson, and one other whose name I can't remember now. I just found stuff in the newspaper like last month about his trip, but no community ever developed around that. And so it was in the 50s when a community, well, in 1947, Ron Price declared, and he was a student at Friends University, I believe, and he learned of the faith through books in the library because Fairmount College Library had a dedicated budget for books, and they began buying Baha'i books, I believe, in the teens, and they were on the list of Mason Remy's universities, and so he sent them books. And some of those books, I believe, they're still in the library. And I called about 5-10 years ago, I called the special librarian's attention to them, so they're moved out of the regular stacks into the historic book kind of things. And that first assembly was formed in 56. It only lasted a year because people moved away. And then the next assembly was in the 60s, about 65 or so. And it's been continuous since then. So thank you, Trish.
A man named Shahriar asks everyone a question. As a historian, how does your work on the early history of the Baha'i faith inform your understanding of current events happening in the Baha'i community? Anyone want to start with that one?
I've thought about this a whole lot. So
Dwayne first.
Huh?
Everyone with a chance. Dwayne, go ahead.
Okay. Because in the 20s, when the Guardian was raising up the administrative order, he changed the nature of the faith for a lot of people. Because in Abdu'l-Baha's time, they didn't have administrative structure. And I see that same kind of change happening now, when the focus is not on building assemblies, which may or may not last, because people are just there to have the 9. Now we're focusing on building actual communities of people who live there. And I think that will be eventually will be a more stable process. But in the process of both of these changes, the faith has lost ground, so to speak. I mean, like Kansas has had 24 cities with assemblies. Now we have 5. But when we begin, when the Institute process takes off in Kansas, and it's taken a long time for people to buy into it, so to speak, I think the results will be much better. So when I write a history book, it'll be a centennial ending in 1997, and that's before the drop-off, basically. So it won't look so bad when the next century starts. It'll start from almost nothing. But I see it as a cyclical thing, and that gives me hope that we're entering a new cycle, and it'll be better in the overall run, because each time it's a different basis of how the community is built.
Gentlemen?
My thought is 2 things. One is it's easy to imagine here we are in our own little Baha'i communities, and we see the people that we see in our communities, and every few years maybe there's a change, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of change. So one thing I see is that over a century, there's huge change in the development of the community and the diversity of activities that go on. Another one is you look at your community and you think, well, you've only heard about the faith for 10, 20 years, whatever, this history is long. Why hasn't anybody done anything? Well, if you actually go and study the lives of individual people, you find out they actually did things. And to recognize that race was an issue 100 years ago and people cared and they tried to do something, I think of that as like a solace of the eyes kind of thing. Like, oh, I'm not the first one to find this upsetting, and I wanted to do something about it. And I love that Thornton Chase was in the Civil War. That was a tearful moment for me. A third one is echoing Dwayne's comment about change. People were used to a certain way of doing things, a certain pattern of things, whatever people thought was real, and this is the way it is. And then things changed. They changed when you had the 1960s with the Culture Revolution and the mass change in the membership of the community, and it's different, and it had to grow and change. And the Institute process, I think, is doing the same thing. And yes, it is reaching more into the community than we may have previously. We were having trouble finding an audience, maybe, and maybe we're doing better at that now.
Do you have a comment?
That's a really tough question, since my son asked the question.
Oh, it was your son who asked the question?
So I was thinking of, if you imagine a river, and we can say the river has different parts. It's a past, present, and future. But then it's a river, so no matter what, the river is the flow of the body of the water. And my feeling about the history, and by that I mean past, present, and future, it is not much that it provides us necessarily with the guidance, but it demonstrates our response, the human response to the guidance given to us. So we can learn a lot from it. Each period has its own circumstances, so it's going to be different, as Dwayne pointed out. At some point, the formation of the spiritual assemblies was the important thing and has to be achieved at all costs. Now the community has changed, but there's certain aspects of the community that the spirit of it, of sacrifice, of devotion, of faith, can run through the whole thing, no matter what are the activities are. I think in that we learn a lot.
Go ahead, Dwayne.
I'd like to add one little point that I began to notice a few decades ago, that when I tell people that the Baha'i faith had been then in Kansas for 100 years, it was very difficult for them then to dismiss it.
Yeah.
Things don't last in Kansas 100 years without some stability, without some staying power. They can't say, oh, that's a weirdo new thing. Then they become the ignorant one. And then they have to reckon with this thing that has been in Kansas for so long, and they didn't know anything about it. And so that's why I want people to know some of the history in their place, because the history of the faith is not just Persia.
Yeah.
The history of the faith is Kansas. It's almost 125 years.
That's right.
When people are confronted with that, then they have to deal with, this is a real thing. And I think that's the most important reason for learning the history, is to share with other people. This is a real thing. And I've gotten stuff on the state historical website about Kansas Baha'i history. So it's becoming part of the real history of the rest of the state of Kansas. And I think that's probably one of my most heartwarming accomplishments, is to bring this into the mainstream. And my daughter was at a conference one time, and somebody, a professor from the university in Wichita, was giving a trivia quiz. And she said something about what happened in Enterprise, Kansas in 1897 or something like that. And it was the Baha'i community. And my daughter went, my dad does that. Just out of the blue. And so I said, yeah, yeah, we're getting there. So it's very nice.
We haven't penetrated the association yet. I've been hoping to do some of that someday. But I find it sometimes you can an approximate summary of history can somehow grab things for people, and say that Felice Sajwar, or Frederick, was the first in 1918, and then to recognize that there was actually a third member of the family that joined the faith around sort of 1970, a little bit later. And remember, I said that was around 100 people at that point for the entire state. So her family was the first, second, and approximately the 100th Baha'i in North Carolina. And then I've recently put together the Eva Lee Flack story, their family, a little bit. So she was a member of the Greensboro Spiritual Assembly, the first of the state. Her sister was a member, if I'm remembering this right, was a member of the first Charlotte Spiritual Assembly in 1958. And her Eva's daughter, Ellen, was a member of the First Spiritual Assembly of Chapel Hill. None of them were living in North Carolina, except the sister had moved back already. But they all came from California back out here to help North Carolina. So these stories of families, of generations, I think is something that needs to be more well understood by the generality of Baha'is. That, I'm a convert in my own lifetime, but my wife's mother was the first Baha'i in our extended family in the 1930s. And that was a different world. And the struggle and to participate and to do things meant driving between states. They at one point they lived in Florida and there was a conference in North Carolina and they went. That was a big deal.
We have some extended families in Kansas too, and one of my goals is to map them, because who was the first, and it's gone to like the fourth generation now, and I don't know all those details. I want those details because it shows the organic and the realness of the faith, that this is not something, some fly-by-night thing. Now, some people come in and out really quickly, but showing that these families are Baha'i families through generations is very significant, and I want to do more on that too.
Here's a question for all three of you. What has given you the passion for doing this history? And what have you personally learned from it?
I don't know, but I'll call up my kids and I'll say, I found another dead one. They say, no, Dad, don't. It's about my grandmother told me stories from her life, and she was born in 1900. And so I feel I have that experience of the entire 20th century. And so this just extends that. And nobody else has done it. My family says, well, why are you doing this? And I'm thinking, well, nobody's done it. Nobody can tell me I'm wrong. And it's the first. I mean, it's all new stuff. And it's new, it's exciting. And it doesn't change. Once somebody has died, the stuff in their life doesn't change. So it's not like things that keep on going to day to day. It's stable and you add more to it. And it's like, it's the detective stuff. My son, I got him, he got hooked on it from one little meeting, and he said, Dad, you're like a detective. Yes, I'm a detective. I'm finding these things. So it's exciting. Every time preparing for today, I got that window when Josie would have had contact with Kerala between November and January. I knew it was sometime in there, but I didn't know it was such a tiny window and specific and after her brother died. I mean, those are very important pieces that make more sense of the rest of it. It was interesting before. Now we know why. Now we know more of likely why. And it's just very satisfying to do that.
Gentlemen, what else?
For the first 20 or so years of my Baha'i life, I was very much into the Seven Valleys and Kitabia Khan and mysticism and transformation of character issues and questions and how do you become noble and these kinds of things. But I realized somewhere in there that I would participate in all these events, conferences and street meetings and booths as me coming to it and not recognizing that I was really part of something larger. I mean, yes, I was part of something larger, but it was just me in there. I was contributing my part. And then to recognize, I'd always liked history. I would read about it, like Dr. Stockman's books. They were great, but I would put them down and then I'd go back to thinking about the Seven Valleys. And then at some point I was thinking, people need to see this actually mattered, that this actually happened. There's a lot of suffering out there, and people really did try to do things, even a long time ago. So then I would pull out the books more, and I'd pay more attention, and then, like I said, Thornton Chase's story really moved me, and I had to do more to help that story and to recognize that story. And the fact, there's a small bits of his life. At one point, he was the normal man of the era, who thought women were better off organizing themselves and not part of his group. But later, he was defending women participating on assemblies. And that shows, people can grow and change. Yeah. And you're not just perfect at the start, you grow into the process. You think about things, you reflect, you come to a new understanding, you read the writings and you think, well, what am I? I'm not doing that. That's different. How do I do that? And oh my God, people change, and they actually tried. That was a big thing for me, of why I participated in this stuff. And then the fact that everything was digitized made it easy for me to do it.
And I was working with 100-year-old newspapers that crumbled on my fingers because nothing was even microfilmed when I started.
Yeah.
One time, my son was with me when it was on microfilm, and he was 2, and I kept feeding him peanut M&Ms so that he would be quiet while I could do the work. And he wasn't hungry for lunch then. I saw this question about Kansas City, and the first Baha'is in Kansas City was in the 19-teens. Somebody who'd gone to school with Louis Gregory, Edith Chapman, but things didn't really start going until the early 30s, the same time as Topeka, because the travel teachers would go from one to the other. And one time even the regional committee organized a conference at the train station in Kansas City, and everybody rode the train in and had their meeting in the rooms, and they rode their train home. And one of the peace planning persons says, "It was so wonderfully done, but we never did it again." So there were kind of parallel communities, but Kansas City had a larger population base. And so there was a little bit more there. And Abdu'l-Baha wrote to 5 people in Kansas City, whereas he wrote to 5 people in Kansas altogether. So there's a little difference, but it was about the same time, really.
Another thing I got to mention that got me really excited at one point was recognizing these very early 19th century newspaper references, all the way back to 1846, 45, as was mentioned. But and that was known among Baha'is, I guess, starting around 1970-ish, and it was included in Hannah the Cause Balyuzi's book, The Biography of the Bab. But even then, there weren't a systematic review of newspapers. And more recently, the last 5 or so years, it's come out that that story has appeared in every English-speaking country that had a newspaper, from Britain to New Zealand. And then I've understood more recently that it's actually appeared in other languages as well. So you could think of that moment as the great mallet hitting the bell, and every nation on earth heard a chance to see it, at least. It's a small column, little bitty story, but there was something new that happened in the world.
Behra, did you want to add a comment?
Sure. In regards to the question, my first history book in regards to the faith I read was at age 13, 14, and that was the Dawnbreakers. So I remember I was reading it, and that was my first interest in the history of the faith. I think I also read God Passes By as well, but that was translated from English to Persian. But I'm thinking of being a fish. You put the fish in the pond, and if this fish is in this pond for a long time and meeting other fish, eventually you might become interested and wants to write the history. So I feel myself as the fish in the pond of St. Louis. I came in 1987. So I've been here for 35 years almost. And meeting individuals, I think one of the individuals I met was Mrs. Vilma Sherrill, and she has a long history of the faith, and she passed away. And I noticed that some individuals pass away, but so I began to think about the history, although as Dwayne says, of writing about dead individuals, but also if we take it early and be proactive and write it about those individuals who are alive and write their history, will make a great sacrifice. So it makes a great service. That's why I began to ask the Baha'is that I knew in Missouri or St. Louis to write their biography for me, how they became a Baha'i. So the history is not only of the past, but of the present. And I think it's about the dead and alive. Of course, none of us are dead anyway. The soul lives on. But that's my short history for response.
I can add a little bit on this next question about, do we know other histories people doing? I know there's a kind of a published, a manuscript of an Arizona history that's been done. I know that I'm pretty sure there's one done for Montana. And of course, South Carolina, there's like, I think, 2 published books plus the PhD, and he's working on a 3rd book. But I think a lot of work needs to be done in a lot of states. And I'm far from finished of North Carolina. One of my tasks that I'm imagining someday doing, if Jean Brodie happens to be listening sooner or later, the daughter of Marie Brodie, she's got a box of pictures, and no one's had a look at those pictures yet. And I'm going to walk there someday with a scanner, and I'm going to be getting all her stories, and I'm going to try to record her stories so that we can bring the pictures together with the stories, and then we can have really something good.
Yeah, one of the next history symposium I'm thinking of doing would be on local communities, because there are quite a few efforts ongoing writing the histories of local Baha'i communities. I think there's one of Wichita, for example, if I remember right. And
I got to mention Burton Smith of Lansing, Michigan. He's working on one for them.
Because that's the way to go. In some ways, it's easier than doing a state, because your local archives will be, quite useful. You're trying to get all the information about a state. You really need to find the DTC bulletins and other statewide, organizations. And some states that those records don't exist, though a lot of them have been moved to the archives in Wilmette. So you can probably find quite a lot of information there. And the archives has been trying to accumulate local membership lists and state membership lists. They used to put out voting lists for each district, and sometimes you can still find those in archives, how many people were available or eligible to be elected as delegate to the convention, in 1950 kind of thing. And those are quite useful sources.
And that's another example of the changing culture. I mean, at the very early conventions, you just had anybody who wanted to go from anywhere in the country to the national convention, you went. And then they started having assemblies send their own representatives. And then it became more formalized and said, well, we're going to actually have a convention and have voting for a delegate, and that'll be the official delegate. And then there was this definition of, well, what's an assembly line? And that changed. So there's lots of ways that culture has changed about how we do things.
Yeah, and until the 1940s, delegates were actually chosen by local assemblies. And if you lived outside an assembly area, you didn't get a chance to vote for a delegate. There was no delegate for you, really. A couple more questions we have here. Patricia says, who's doing a history for Wichita? So I suppose
I've answered that.
Okay, very good. Oh, Richard Vore. Yes, I think he might be one of the people, that I've been in touch with. Joyce Olinga asks about Kansas City and Lee Summit. And there was another one, St. Charles County. Was it St. Charles? Is that the other one?
I don't know anything. That's too close to Missouri, to St. Louis. I don't know St. Charles.
Yeah, I've included St. Charles in other volumes. In fact, for Missouri, I've included Springfield, Missouri, Rolla, Columbia, and St. Charles as well. So those are in other.
An anonymous person asks this: the Baha'i faith is the first religion to undergo exponential growth in a highly digitized and globalized world. What unique benefits and challenges does this context present to historians of the Baha'i faith? So historians, answer the question. You all are being addressed as historians, so you're historians, right?
First is the opportunity. So if you're doing research on the history of Jesus Christ, you don't get to look up the local newspapers and figure out what people were talking about, and when was his trial and who was there standing around and all that stuff. We have newspapers covering all these things in addition to the archives. But the challenge then becomes misspellings, wrong names. For example, Louis Gregory. We all know how we spell Louis Gregory, but there were newspapers that spelled him Lewis, and I had not the slightest imagination that that's a permutation that I would have to catch in order to find mentions of him sometimes. Or two people with the same name. We have a case of a Civil War veteran. I can't remember his name just this moment. Two different people with the same name, both Civil War veterans, both lived in Chicago around the same time. Dr. Stockman, because he was on the assembly in Chicago, and he had a limp. He had a limp, I remember, some kind of deformity or structural. He was on a crutch a lot of the time. They both moved to San Jose California near the end of their life. And they were both buried, we think, in the same cemetery.
Oh my God.
And we can't tell who's who, but it's two people. So that's one of the struggles. I did a presentation one time on a Baha'i, and he may even have been from Kansas. I can't remember right now. Several people with the same name around the same time. He became a Baha'i in Paris, was in World War One, I think. His doppelganger was in World War One, died, and his name was published across the newspapers as, hey, our friend, even from that town, our friend, the Baha'i, not they didn't know he was a Baha'i, but they meant the one from the Baha'i, has died. But it wasn't him. He had died 10 years earlier from TB in Colorado. So you run into those kinds of challenges.
Yeah.
I think that it's important to preserve the archives, even if it seems very trivial or not important, not to get rid of them, to preserve it, because for future that might be different. My interest in the history of St. Louis developed. I would say my interest in history of the United States developed because I read Dr. Stocksman's book on the Baha'i Faith in Americas, the 2 volumes, and it was very fascinating. But in terms of St. Louis, because I began to collect the archives and the papers, as the friends were keeping these boxes in their basement, they would bring it to our center, and I put it into a file. And I was reading these files, and I found so much information that helped me that I need to work on this project.
That's good. That's good.
I was helping an assembly once with their archives and met with the assembly, and one person said, "Why do we have to keep all this old stuff? It's just taking up space." And I said, "Well, this proves that you were doing something."
Yeah.
And people are going to look back, and if they don't have any evidence, they're going to say, "We just sat around and did nothing with this message." This proves that you were making an effort. Yeah. And that satisfied them. I don't know what happened after that, but they just wanted to get rid of it. And I have seen so many cases where people have thrown out stuff because it's just old stuff. They don't know how to save it or where to save it. And I've got checkbook registers from the Topeka Baha'i Library showing how much money went through, because that shows an indication of the interest level of the community in the books that were coming out. And that's the intimate part. That's the human part of this history. And one thing I've been very surprised with some of these families whose family members were involved in enterprise, when they learned that somebody was interested in their family, they have given me pictures. One lady gave me her photo albums to take anything out that I wanted. Now, I did get, it's not 100% because one person I wrote to, and I tracked down the sister-in-law of the lady who received the tablet, and I got this really nasty letter back: "Stay away from my aunt." Well, it happened to be the son of the woman that Abdu'l-Baha wrote to, but he didn't know anything about it, and he didn't want anything to do with it. And so I said, okay, fine, because I can get stuff out of the newspaper anyway, and the censuses and things. So I've got her life history, but I have to speculate on why she may have written to Abdu'l-Baha.
Yeah.
I can kind of get some of that because she was a young woman. It was 1920. She even abbreviated her German name to be more American. She was an independent woman, but there were not that many opportunities in that time, but she demonstrated some there, and it's part of my history now. Even if he doesn't want it, that's fine. I don't have to mention him at all, and I don't, except he exists. He's her son. But it's been very helpful. And then on findagrave.com, I've been able to link families together. We had, by reading family obituaries, especially obituaries of the parents of Baha'is, I found connections between Baha'is that I had no idea. The people who were Baha'is with them knew they were sisters, but nobody wrote it down because it was obvious. And so I'm finding these groups of sisters, these family connections are, whoa, and whoa. And so I'm able to tie it together because that's the human part that we miss otherwise. And so I read everybody's obituaries. I mean, I'm looking them up because it tells you the husband's obituary tells about the income, the social status of them. The wife's doesn't. And anyway, it's just all this stuff. And so I've got these stacks and stacks of papers, and my kids say, "What are we going to do with this, Dad?" And I said, "Well, it's not mine. It belongs to the Baha'i community. Now, I'm not sure what's going to happen to it, but it's here." And that's another problem. What do we do with it so that it can be saved? Because it's not mine, and I never think it's mine. I've got thousands of clippings, well, or at least 1,000, all over the state. It's not mine. So that's another big question. So anyway,
the archives. Yeah, regarding the treasury materials, if you look at Baha'i Faith in America, Volume 1, you'll notice that I show the amount of money given to the Kenosha Baha'i Fund every month. And when the faith is attacked by the Christian missionaries, it does not drop. When Ibrahim Karela begins to question Abdu'l-Baha and the community's unity is broken, the donations dropped right off. And I should give a shout out to a 16-year-old Seth Tucker, who actually had to go to the archives and get that information for me, because at that time I was back in Massachusetts, and of course Seth is now in his 50s and living in upstate New York. So he was really quite useful at that particular time. We have another question from Jan Yassian here. Baha'u'llah states that those who use their pens to defend the faith are blessed. Do you think that this applies to the early newspaper editors, and how important is this? And that's a really interesting question.
I have one clipping where the newspaper did defend the faith, and I think it might be the very first time. And I think that's very significant. Other than that, when they're making fun of the faith, no, I don't think there's any on that.
Right.
But that one that defends the faith, I think that's significant.
There are some mysteries of connections. For example, Reverend Austin Wright wrote a paper in 1851 to the American Oriental Association, or American Oriental Society. And I found it because it was published in a newspaper. And that gave me a clue finding the original. But that was 1851, I said. A mystery is, in 1865, 3 months, I think, on the order of months after the march of General Sherman through Atlanta that burned down newspapers, this newspaper sets back up. On the front page of this Southern newspaper is that article. Wow. It doesn't say where he got it from. Just here we are. This story from 1851, the Bab and things going on in Persia. Why was on the front page of a newspaper in just rebuilt Atlanta? Columbia, South Carolina. Why was this back on the front page of a newspaper 15 years later from a Yankee source? There's a mystery. It deserves to be dug into.
And he may never be able to figure it out either.
True.
He may never be able to figure it out. I was most surprised that we're working on an article about Abdu'l-Baha, and the Baha'i historian who's in Germany quoted a Turkish source talking about how Abdu'l-Baha had predicted World War I, and nobody listened. And I'm reading that thinking, well, how the heck did this guy know about that? Because it was in newspapers in the United States and Canada and all this. Well, now this Baha'i has added the footnote. He was the nephew of the Turkish ambassador to Washington, who had entertained Abdu'l-Baha frequently when Abdu'l-Baha was in Washington in 1912. So now we know how the nephew knew Abdu'l-Baha had predicted World War I. His uncle had told him. He had heard Abdu'l-Baha say it. So there are these really interesting little connections that you never know how to trace down. There's the complaint of Florence Breed. When Abdu'l-Baha was speaking in Dublin, there was this particular brother of a prominent American statesman who was attending Abdu'l-Baha's talks, never asked any questions, and she was complaining he always seemed to be drunk whenever he was listening to Abdu'l-Baha speak. Well, the guy later was the ambassador to Japan. Martha Root comes up to him saying, "Can you help me about things?" He says, "Sure, of course. I met Abdu'l-Baha in Dublin." and it was then very helpful for Martha Root in Japan. So
It's great connection.
funny little things. How would you ever make those connections? But sometimes you can find these connections, and they're really quite exciting when you can find them, because most of the time you can't find these kinds of things.
But developing biographies of the editors of the newspapers who had these stories when they raise things up, that'll be a job that we'll have to do as part of digging up Baha'i mentions, the people mentioned in the articles. We have to find their stories, the obituary articles, the census entries. But the people who wrote the newspapers then gathered the material. Sometimes they were just copying things, but sometimes they took an actual interest. I remember one newspaper, one of the other echoes of that first article on 1845-46, I found in the newspaper, they had an article discussing the Sunni Shiite split. And I was like, what is an 19th century article in a newspaper? And I think this was in New Orleans. What is a newspaper in New Orleans discussing Sunni Shiite political splits and the history of the religious split? This is amazing. What editor is this?
I think it's important to remember that there was no National Geographic magazine in those days. There were the equivalent of the Atlantic magazine and those kinds of things, but the local newspapers had a much wider mandate, you might say, than they do today, because they were the main source of information for the entire world, for that local community. And so in addition to printing little notices like such and such has gone off to pick blueberries for 3 days up in the hills, or such and such's uncle is now visiting from, Minnesota. These kinds of things that the local community people needed to know, but they published some of the strangest things because it just struck the editor's fancy. And I think people ought to know about this locally. It really is quite interesting.
Novels and poems. I've got reference to a little camping trip that Kerala's son took with some of the other kids in the neighborhood. They were part of the community because there was so few people out there and there was nothing else to read. Yep. So you got the newspaper. Yeah, it had everything.
Yep. Thornton Chase published poems in Colorado before he was a Baha'i in the local newspapers. And going through those darn microfilms, I found a bunch of them. Now I can probably find a lot more. And you guys forgot to mention that Thornton Chase lived in eastern Kansas for a while, too.
He did. But see, he's not part of the history.
He wasn't a Baha'i.
That's right.
He wasn't a Baha'i at the time. What else do we have? We probably should wrap up. But I'm delighted that we were able to do this meeting. So I'll give all of you a little bit of a time to give some sort of a conclusion. And I think Steve has a comment. So Steve, go ahead.
I will. I was just saying there was another question about the importance of writing our will and testament, and I agree. Summary thoughts. When I wrote that 2018 sort of seminar paper collection history, I predicted that I would be correcting things, and I hoped I wouldn't be correcting things very soon. But I'm sure I wasn't getting everything right. Well, it's only 3 years later, and I'm massively needing to rewrite. And I predict there will be more corrections that will come along, but more surprises. And I hope heartwarming stories that begin to connect with people who remember, but are still around. God bless them, Mr. Tucker's stories, I think really need as wide an audience as possible to hear the struggles of the early Baha'is of North Carolina over the issues of race, the kind of protests that were done. This is echoed independently in that PhD from 1977 that I mentioned, where it's written out. Yeah, I think it helps to know that people tried, and they've been trying for a long time.
Gentlemen, Bahar'ad, some people were saying, how can they learn more about some of the local histories you've been collecting?
Sure. Actually, I was answering this right now. I was typing the answer, sending it privately. But yeah, I'll be happy if somebody wants to reach out to me via my email. If they have any particular question, I'll be happy to provide them with what I have. But these are now all in a file that I collect. There are like 20 files, but they're not published. They're just the research.
I would like to have any information, anybody who has been a member of the Kansas Baha'i community, to send me, because if you've got it, I don't have it, and I want it. I mean, I'm greedy. like that. And I've known too many people, like one lady, a very prominent, longtime, steadfast Baha'i in Kansas City, Kansas, and she died. And years later, someone said, well, she had everything stored in her garage and her daughters bulldozed it all. And there went decades of the Kansas City history.
Yep.
Another person got tired of boxes in his basement and hired somebody to throw it out. And then later he realized, oh, some of those boxes were brand new Baha'i books. Some of those boxes were DTC stuff. I mean, that just rips me up because look, I mean, somebody somewhere wants it.
Yep.
I want it if it has anything to do with Kansas. There are other people like that. You ask around first before you throw it out because you don't know what might be valuable to somebody else. And we've lost so much already. It just breaks my heart. And that's all I'm saying is this throwaway culture we live in is our detriment. Yeah. Now, we don't need to save necessarily, well, yeah, we might. I'm not even going to go there what we should throw away. But
digitize it before you throw it out if you can't have the space. And if you can give it to someone else to keep it, do that.
Yes.
I think one thing in terms of preservation of the archives, which archives itself is an institution of the faith, in the light of guidance, Shoghi Effendi to refer to that, is that if friends have a place to take it, it's helpful. So as soon as we opened the Baha'i Information Center in St. Louis, people brought the albums that they have kept of the Baha'i activities. In fact, one of the friends shipped me 4 boxes from Florida that then we put it. So if there is a place that we can talk about it and people know about it, they'll be happy probably to drop them in somewhere. But this information has to go around and people need to know about it. I agree.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for this marvelous hour and 3/4 of discussion about Baha'i history. I'm hoping, like I said, that we'll be able to do another one like this on local Baha'i histories at some point in the next perhaps 6 months. I should add that I'm also hoping the Wilmette Institute can begin to publish articles and accounts, memoirs, little biographies. And eventually, I would love to see us have somewhere in the United States a local Baha'i history journal or a periodical so that people can do their own local research. And there's a place, not just to publish it, but also a place where it can be read. People can get advice about how to tighten it up, improve the quality of the writing, and to think more deeply about some aspects of the history, because the peer review process, which can be a real pain, also is very valuable. And you end up often improving on what people have written with the feedback. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to start getting these things published at some point soon when we have a little more time. But meanwhile, we're able to do these symposia, and I'm hoping we'll have some more. And I hope all of you will continue to write and continue to produce and put things up on Bahaipedia. Steve knows how to do that. So I hope Behrad and Dwayne, you check with him about that. So meanwhile, I want to thank our audience very much for sticking around for such a long session today. You have something else, Dwayne?
Yes, I have an article now about Barbara Ursum being considered by Kansas History Journal.
Good.
The editor feels that is a topic worthy of notice. It should be part of the history. And so it's in the review process right now. So some progress is being made. I hope it goes through.
Excellent. That's good news. That's very good news, because it's nice to publish it for the Baha'is, but it's even better if it's, of course, spread out to the whole world so that other people can learn about the contributions Baha'is have been making to the culture and the community and the society that we all live in. So thank everybody again. Thank you, our audience, and thank you, presenters. And the Wilmette Institute looks forward to having everybody join us again in 2 weeks with presentations about stories about Abdul Baha, and then 2 other presentations later on in June. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you, Wilmette Institute.